I tell you what, it's never going to be polished if you're first time checking out the channel. And since it's the first video I'm doing, I guess it's the first time you're checking out the channel. I have another channel, couple Wook Plus and all that jam. And I'm trying to get the poetry out there. I've been writing since I was 14, which is over 4 decades ago. So I'm here today to represent the unheard poets, the break down the thing most people read or write poetry feel at some point, but don't have language for. And that's who actually decides what poetry is. You know, not in a personal sense, what moves you, what resonates, but in a public institutional sense. What gets published, what gets funded, what gets taught, what gets labeled as serious or important. Now, I know you hear about it. It's in whispers and barrooms, coffee shops. The poetry is run by gatekeepers. No one wants to say that out loud. You know, most of us know that the real stuff, the guttural late night truth, doesn't live in magazines or MFA workshops. It lives on the street in unfiltered voices whose rhythm is a jackhammer that reveals diamonds. And for me, the inclination is spot on. Poetry, especially in the contemporary United States, operates within a strange little ecosystem, a poetry industrial complex, so to speak. And it's not a single organization, it's a network of institutions that collectively shape the field. This includes universities, MFA programs, literary magazines, publishers, prize committees, and nonprofit foundations. These institutions don't just support poetry, they actively define it. They determine what styles are visible, what voices are amplified, and what kinds of work are considered legitimate. It follows fashion and rewards proximity. The right editor reading, you might get the nod. You know, that old cliche about who you know has become an invisible submission guideline. If you want recognition, there is a sanctioned road, a tried and true way of carefully crafted, worked over until nothing unpredictable survives poetry that's forged in workshops. It can be electric, but it is more often than not so well behaved it loses its truth. Academia asks the poet to translate themselves into something publishable, full of language theory, perfect IAMs, and workshop norms. One of the key mechanisms used here is competition. Contests, fellowships, residencies are framed as opportunities, but they also function as filters. There are thousands of poets who submit work, often paying entry fees, and only a very small number are selected. You do the math there. That selection process creates an artificial scarcity that increases the perceived value of those who win. And over time, this shapes the kind of poetry people write. Writers begin to internalize what gets rewarded. Certain tones, structures, and themes become more common, not necessarily because they're more truthful or more powerful, but because they are more likely to succeed within the system. This is where the idea of the workshop poem comes in. A style that feels familiar to anyone who's been through a college creative writing course or read a lot of contemporary literary journals. It is the story old as time, this relationship between poetry and power. Historically, institutions have supported and promoted poetry for cultural and political reasons. During the Cold War, poetry was used as a form of soft power, representing national identity and intellectual freedom. Poetry exists inside systems of influence represented most often by the editor, the gatekeeper, subtle but omnipresent. It's not usually about explicit exclusion. Instead, it operates through taste, through editorial preference, through what is considered finished, refined, or serious. But taste is not neutral. It's shaped by education, class, access, and institutional norms. So when certain kinds of poetry are consistently selected, published, and awarded, those preferences become normalized. They start to feel like objective standards, even though they're historically and culturally specific. They result in a feedback loop. Institutions reward certain work, writers adapt to those expectations, that work becomes more dominant, and the definition of poetry narrows. So, what does this mean for people writing outside the system or those who don't want to participate in it? You get shut out. But then you realize there is another side, another scene. It is the poems that spill out from the feedback of an open mic night or a half broken PA. It is the words that fill the back of junk mail and little notebooks walking home from a 10-hour shift. It is the poetry of the street, because ultimately poetry dies in institutions. It exists prior to them in the songs that predate writing and will exist long after they have faded from memory. Institutions can shape visibility, but they don't create the act itself. It's poetry that doesn't care if it's publishable. It's poetry that refuses to ask permission to exist. It's defiant poetry that shows up and dares you to look away. The problem is no one sees these poems. The system decides who gets published, who works as a system to filter. It works as a system to filter voices. The record kept is incomplete. Magazines are archives of what a small, insulated group think poetry is. People who I am sure are trying to imperfectly make sense of what matters, but only hear echoes. And I'm not making it into a mustache twirling villain situation. It's just the system doing what it does, narrowing. But that's where the tension swirls. Somewhere between saying what matters and having the poem be something that might last. You end up with a disconnect. Poets smoothing the edges of their voice to get in the door or refusing to compromise and risk their voice being unheard. Which raises one final question. If poetry is being defined by a relatively small network of gatekeepers, why do we accept those definitions as authoritative? And what happens if we don't? That's where this becomes less about critique and more about possibility. Because if those systems aren't absolute, then neither are their standards. And that opens up space for different forms, different voices, different ways of thinking about what poetry can be. Poetry isn't owned by magazines or collected anthologies of the best new poets, but magazines do act like a style book defining what is considered a poem at the current moment. The real stuff, the messy, unpredictable, unrepeatable, blood and sweat poetry happens elsewhere, off the page. If you listen close, somewhere between a whisper and a scream, you can hear it, where nobody's asking for credentials to have your voice heard. You all keep out writing out there. Just keep going, keep doing it every day. Put that pen to paper. If you like this video, hit the thumbs up, leave a comment, subscribe. I plan on hitting more topics like this and getting deeper into what we need to do to bring back culture to a world captivated by 30-second videos on TikTok. What I like to think of as the new renaissance that is coming sooner than you imagine. I'll talk to you soon. Thank you so much. Like, subscribe, links down in the description.